It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast world editor Nico Hines joins us from London. How are you, sir?
I'm well. Good evening.
Good evening to Borzu Dargahi, international correspondent for The Independent. How's things?
Very good, thank you.
Thanks as well for Leila Jacinto for stopping in. She cracks the whip at France24.com. How's business?
It's been busy.
It's been a busy week. Has it been a busy week for France 24 Berlin correspondent Nick Spicer?
Somewhat busy, lots of Ukraine. Thanks, François. Yep.
Oh, well, I'm glad you mentioned Ukraine. It's coming up next. The World This Week, by the way, where you can watch, but also listen, subscribe, and like us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. Yeah, the week began with Emmanuel Macron heading for Moscow in what he hoped would be the start of the long road to de-escalation over Ukraine. What he found was an even longer table. There he sat alone across from his host for more than 5 hours of closed-door talks. Much has been made, Nico Hines, of the optics of Macron and Putin sitting very far apart, both during that photo op and at the subsequent press conference, since the Reuters news agency reporting a lot of it had to do with COVID protocols, the French president refusing to have a Russian doctor give him a PCR test. Nico Hines?
Hello, sorry. Yeah, I quite like the idea that Macron didn't want to risk having a Russian doctor probe inside his head, which maybe for wise reasons. I'm not sure exactly what the Russians were going to do with a DNA sample of him. Look up his ancestry on ancestry.com or something. It kind of, I don't know, but I do understand his reticence. The photo itself, unfortunately, they just look like two little children in class at opposite ends of a long table. And, I was skeptical about Macron's visit to Moscow before he went, especially since he went to Moscow first. And as yet, it does seem like it's only kind of damaged Macron's reputation in that inevitably with these situations, you come away and the only thing you can say is, well, Putin told me he was going to do X, or, well, Putin assured me that there'd be no further escalations. And, obviously Macron has no power to know whether that's going to be true or not. And his reputation is then kind of held hostage by Putin, and he just sounds a bit silly defending his corner. But that's what will always happen if you go and report back on what these people say to you.
Of course, what is the alternative to not go, Borzu Dargahi?
Yeah, I think that's the real issue here. One of the working theories among diplomats and political scientists is that Putin is doing all of this with Ukraine to get recognition, to get his proper respects, to have people listen to his grievances and to have people listen to Russian grievances. And so you have this parade of high-level officials making their way to Moscow and meeting with Putin, meeting with Lavrov in the case of Liz Truss of the UK and so on, and just hearing him out in hopes that that'll be enough, that, we'll give the man his proper respect, we'll kind of defer to him, we'll come to your territory and listen to what you have to say, regardless of whether, we do anything about it. And hopefully this will give him a graceful out, because he sort of backed himself into a corner here, hasn't he, with regard to the various threats he's made and the troop buildups and so on. And if he backs down without seemingly obtaining anything, it would be really, really hard for him, and it would be very embarrassing for him.
Right. So in a way, the optics is rewarding bad behavior. And, when you looked at that long table, I think it was a German newspaper that said, well, that's big enough to accommodate both their egos. Definitely in the Washington press, in the U.S. press, not the Biden administration comments, they seem to be much more disparaging of Macron's Monsieur Fix-It shuttle diplomacy. But I think everybody agrees, and Bozu is right on that, Putin needs to be given a ramp-down avenue. But really, technically, what did Macron achieve out of that? Not much.
Not much. Well, Macron would argue not much yet, but we'll see about that. Just one more question about this table, because, and I'll put it to you, Nick Spicer. Putin's reported germophobia miraculously dissipated just 1 week ago. The Russian president was the guest of honor at the opening ceremonies at the Beijing Winter Olympics, and you didn't need a long table or a big yardstick between him and Xi Jinping. So what is that table about?
I don't know. It looked like an enormous shuffleboard game to me. It was comically huge. I don't know what the thing in the middle was, but I guess it's germophobia. Interesting to note that Donald Trump had germophobia as well. Just to come back to Emmanuel Macron's trip, I mean, not to defend it, but I think he did as good as he could under the circumstances and gave Putin the ability to show that people were coming to sort of not quite cap in hand, but to talk to him, world leaders. France is, of course, a P5 member of the Security Council, nuclear power. And if you compare his visit to that, it was Liz Truss, the foreign secretary of the United Kingdom, the next day, who sort of let the British press know that they were going to talk tough, unlike those French cheese-eating surrender monkeys, and was really shot down by Sergei Lavrov, who said the discussion was basically one between somebody who was dumb and somebody who was deaf, in other words, completely useless. So Macron, by my estimation, kind of came out a little bit better and moved the ball forward, because the Russians don't want to be talked down to. That's not really going to help. I've worked, as a correspondent there for 3 years. They don't like to be talked down to. The way, I think, towards peace is basically giving them the ego boost that they need. And, it might be distasteful, but coming and talking to them and making them feel important is probably going to be the way forward and the way to preserve peace.
All right, despite all the diplomacy, though, that troop movement seems to continue. Thursday saw the start of what Moscow insists were long-planned joint maneuvers with forces inside of Belarus, 30,000 of them. The Kremlin insists they'll be withdrawing once they're finished. They didn't say when. Those, of course, are not the only troops on the move. Ukraine finds itself surrounded on 3 sides by what some estimate to be 130,000 plus forces. The biggest concern is to the southwest, east of Ukraine, the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And there, Moscow gearing up for naval maneuvers next week. Ukraine and its backers accuse Moscow of at best disrupting sea traffic out of the Ukrainian port of Mariupol, which is sandwiched between Crimea and the Donbass, and at worst, preparing a land grab. Russia's ambassador to the EU denies.
Fleet, they will be engaged in major exercises. So this has nothing to do with Ukraine. Well, actually, they are doing what armed forces of any country are expected to be doing in their own national territory. Exercising, normally, learning to operate their weaponry and the rest. But nothing that could be considered as threatening either Ukraine or any other neighboring country.
There, Nico Heinz, you reassured?
Yeah, no, funnily enough, I'm not reassured. Although I have to say, it does seem as though Kiev is the most relaxed capital city about this whole thing. All of the kind of talk coming out of there is that, they're used to these sorts of provocations and that they understand that Europe and the US have got their back and there's nothing to worry about. While other capitals, Paris, Washington, London, seem to be raising the alarm rather higher. So it remains to be seen who is right. If I was surrounded on 3 sides by over 130,000 Russian troops, I think I'd be a little concerned.
All right, Joe Biden is certainly not taking any chances. The U.S. president sounding the alarm and warning American citizens in Ukraine that GIs will not swoop in to rescue them should Russia invade.
American citizens should leave now. We're dealing with one of the largest armies in the world. This is a very different situation, and things could go crazy quickly.
Borzu Dargahi.
Well, I mean, I can't really speak to what he said and what intelligence he may have and what kind of possibly psychological operations that was intended as.
Psychological operations?
Absolutely. It's a way of basically calling Putin's bluff. And by not playing his game of downplaying, by playing it up, you're basically taking away his trump card, which is threats. And I think that is something really important to note. The root of this whole crisis is the expansion of NATO, these countries in Eastern Europe rushing to join NATO. And Putin is almost proving them right. Russia's behavior towards Ukraine is like one big advertisement for joining NATO. Why wouldn't you want to join NATO? If you're an Eastern European country, why wouldn't you want to join NATO? He's basically saying that there's no such thing as Ukraine. He's menacing, by implication, Moldova and Romania and Bulgaria and all these other Eastern European countries. I'm sure they are very happy that they join Ukraine, and I'm sure that they join NATO, and I'm sure countries like Ukraine and Georgia and other countries that happen to lie in Russia's historic sphere of influence are thinking the same.
Well, I mean, which comes down to, what are the negotiations talking about now? Now, Macron was locked in 5-hour discussions with Putin. He apparently did not use the word Finlandization, which I had to look up, and apparently it is indeed a word. No. But, Finlandization, which
is what reporters heard on the plane going to Russia.
This is right, but he had to, his people had to draw back from it. Finlandization is not a term that people from Finland approve of. Because it was a neutrality that was forced upon them, the other terms of so far what we are talking about, the Normandy Four, which is the OSCE, the European Security Group, Ukraine and Russia. They had talks today, and they were very difficult talks. We're talking about the Minsk Agreement, which was signed in 2015, when Ukraine didn't really have a choice about this. Now, the Ukrainian president has a very hard sell if he's going to give his population the Minsk agreements. So, I mean, the fundamentals of, even how we discuss a ramp down is not in NATO's favor. Putin has thrown up this aggression, and nobody is even... nobody is, no, people are, but, at the very fundamentals of this is this concept of sphere of influence, which does not take into account, as Borzu said, nobody wants to be part of the Russian influence, and they should not be. So, a lot of this talk is really the West, in a way, NATO has shown a united front, but there are calibrated differences between how Berlin is responding, between how Washington is responding, and Monsieur Fixit, Macron, trying to bridge these two divides. So I think the West could have a much stronger and much more united response to this.
Have you sensed, one final point on this, very briefly, Nick Spicer, have you sensed any improvement in terms of Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, on this?
Well, he's heading to Moscow in the next 48 hours, so let's see what he says. He hasn't pronounced those magic words, Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that Germany has with Russia that is not yet pumping gas, but it has a sort of story equivalent of Lord Voldemort, the pipeline that shall not be named. I just want to come back to Mariupol. I was speaking to a friend who's a correspondent there today, and she said she's been talking to the Azov Battalion, which is not the Ukrainian army. It's a far-right militia that liberated Mariupol from Russian separatists in 2015, and she says they are worried. They are very worried. Zelensky needs to say to the people, look, there's not going to be a war. He needs to preserve a certain state of non-panic in the economy because there's rising inflation, you can't raise capital, businesses are complaining. So his messaging is partly political. He may be, we don't know, very afraid of an invasion, but he's going to kill the economy if he tells people that they're in serious trouble. So those are the things that, I would put forward. And then we'll just see what Olaf Scholz says. If he actually says those words, Nord Stream 2, when he's in Moscow, I'd be surprised. Journalists have tried for weeks now, and just doesn't want to talk about it.
Speaking of killing the economy, in Canada, day 15 of a truckers' protest against COVID vaccine rules, that's laid siege to the capital, Ottawa, and halted traffic across the Ambassador Bridge, where $400 million worth of goods pass every day to and from the United States. The movement has forced work slowdown and stoppages at car factories on the Michigan side of the border. Protesters insist they are misunderstood.
There's days where I feel like I cry a lot. I find this really difficult with the situation that our government is putting us through because we're not vaccinated. We go through a lot of emotions. Our children go through a lot as well, just not us as parents, but our children as well. I think what we need to do right now is respect everyone's choices and just let us breathe. Let us breathe. We need to breathe.
We need to breathe. Borzu Daragai.
Well, I mean, I just generally, I don't have a lot of sympathy for the anti-vaxxers. I mean, their arguments just, kind of fall apart. They say that it's illegal to force people to have vaccines. It's unethical. It's against freedom. Yet, we have every single country in the world that I've ever lived in has a very complex system of vaccine requirements. They say that the vaccine passes are intrusive, that they're Orwellian, and so on. Yet I didn't see any of these protesters out on the streets when the revelations about mass surveillance by the CIA or the NSA were going on. Frankly, they're all holding cell phones that are essentially mobile phones that are essentially surveillance devices. So I just don't buy their arguments on any front. This is a health crisis. It's a global health crisis. Governments are trying to do the best that they can. Up until very recently, intensive care units were overwhelmed. Healthcare systems were collapsing, and doctors were and nurses were threatening to quit the business altogether. It was a health crisis. It was a genuine health crisis. And everyone has to pull together. And, the vaccines worked and the testing worked. And we're kind of finally slowly moving out of this phase.
All right. Well, fortunately, we have a Canadian in our midst to explain it all. Nick Spicer, is this something that is a very small movement that makes a lot of noise, or how much sympathy do these protesters have in Canada?
Well, when I saw this story breaking, it's, I guess, 2 weeks old now, I wanted to say that's not Canadian. But of course, maybe I just need to take a good hard look in the mirror, because it is Canadian. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in a part, the sort of ground zero is a part of Ottawa where my family lives that I know quite well. And I was a bit, I have to say, outraged, because they're down in a part of town where homeless people live, and those big 18-wheelers were honking their horns all day long, preventing people from getting to the Salvation Army from helping the homeless people, until a judge said, look, you got to stop honking your horn. That's not political messaging. That is not free speech. You're just making noise. I think it's tempting to look at this and see, is this going to be some kind of Tea Party thing? And what I have been reading about it is that I think, the Canadians are just as, apt to adopt, I'm not going to say, these populist, science skeptical policies as Americans, or indeed any other people around the world are. But the political system of Canada is one where they won't actually get into positions of power. So to directly answer your question, about 2/3 of people in Canada don't like this truckers movement. 90% of truckers are vaccinated. 1/3 of the people say they have some ideas, but they don't have a leader. You've got some neo-Nazis in there. You've got some people who don't want people to wear masks. You've got other people who are saying you must accept our lists of demands, or the Governor General and Parliament and the Senate all have to automatically dissolve, which doesn't sound really like they're into freedom and democracy. So the measure that the Ontario Premier has taken, targeting the people who are blocking the Ambassador Bridge, over which $320 million of goods transit every day, slowing the production at General Motors and Toyota, making them stop shifts and people not go to work, lose their jobs perhaps in the future. That's focusing minds, I think. And the federal government has announced that it's going to review, not saying this is in reaction to the situation, those border COVID policies next week. So there could be an end in sight.
All right. And as you say, that state of emergency imposed by Canada's premier, the standoff also putting Canada's prime minister in the spotlight.
You cannot stop a pandemic with blockades. You cannot end a pandemic by decree. You can't end a pandemic by legislation. You need to end a pandemic by relying on science, by public health measures, and by vaccinations.
Nico Hines, your reactions to Justin Trudeau's words.
Well, obviously he's got a point there. I mean, it's quite baffling, some of the demands that these truckers have come up with. I think one of them is for Trudeau to be put on trial for treason and then executed. So they're not mincing words, these guys. And you know what has become obvious is that pretty much every guy and woman who is in that convoy and who is camping out in Ottawa and elsewhere have their own personal sort of belief system that's driving them forward. And this has become a sort of, it's like the kind of like 70s movie, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And people are just taking to the streets to show how fed up they are. And, I think that does gain a lot of sympathy around the world because I think a lot of us are feeling fed up and we've had enough of all of this. And yes, it's a relatively small number of people, but, I think on the crowdfunder, they raised something like $10 million with 100,000 people donating. So, it is catching fire in some ways. And a lot of people haven't read the small print of what the demands are. They're just saying, do you know what? We've had enough of this pandemic now. Let's move on with our lives. And although that may not be a very scientifically literate response, I do have some sympathy. And you have to admire they've put on one hell of a good protest. There's headlines all over the world. They've had a real impact. People are listening to them. When we drill down into the details, maybe they haven't got the greatest of points, but I do think it's a good reminder that you can generate interest, you can put a voice forward if you really go out there and protest in an impressive, cohesive way.
Yeah, it's inspired other movements in places like New Zealand and right here in France. They have Convoy de la Liberté, Freedom Convoys. They've been barred from laying siege to the capital. A court injunction late on Friday telling him not to come. Nonetheless, some are trying. Many of the protesters are the same who took part in the Yellow Vest movement. Their attempt to emulate the Canadians comes, 2 months before we stage a presidential election here.
Moi, je connais pas la politique, je m'en fous. J'en ai rien à carrer. Moi, je suis juste là pour reprendre mes droits comme un citoyen.
On prend la route pour aller manifester.
Non, pour aller à Paris, pour défendre notre liberté.
À nous, la liberté, on l'a perdue. L'égalité, elle a disparu aussi.
Vila Jacinto.
It's such a free-for-all. People have to be corrected about what they are protesting for. Look, in terms of Canada, to Nick Spicer as the American over here, we always say blame Canada, but when it comes to what happens in Ottawa, there's an element of blame USA as well, because this was taken on by right-wing groups. There was a lot of funding that came from the US, from US influencers, using apps like Telegram, which is run by the Russian brothers. And, it's the same phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. Today, it is the anti-vax. 2 years ago, it was the Gilets jaunes. But it's just a collection of all, the people who just feel disgruntled by the system.
The root of it is, I'm so sorry to say this, the root of this whole movement is this sort of anti-Semitism, a sort of merger of these kind of general grievances about the direction that the elites are taking the government, and this kind of view of what they call globalism. This, the vaccine is this tool used by global elites to, and the tropes there are, basically just the same tropes.
But to Nico's point, that's just some people are fed up after 2 years of wearing masks.
I'm fed up with wearing the masks, but I'm not going out there and allowing myself to be recruited by a neo-fascist movement.
One final point on this before we go. Nick Spicer, blame Canada or blame the U.S., as Leela was just saying?
Leela's got a point. There were payments of $230,000 to these Yeah, good point. Thank you for saying that. I was thinking of that blame Canada thing, and it is kind of funny. And there are rules in countries about foreign financing of elections. For instance, the United Kingdom, when Russian money comes in, that's not supposed to happen in their investigations. But this is a protest movement that is having possibly an effect on Canadian democracy. And maybe there needs to be, I know I'm going to sound like Big Brother here, maybe there needs to be some legislation looking at who funds this kind of political activity, which is what it is. So blame Canada, blame the US. I think blame, largely speaking, the people who don't trust science. And I have to agree with the point that anti-Semitism underlies a good part of the far-right element in the anti-vax movement. That's certainly the case in Germany, and it's disheartening to see.
All right. Speaking of campaigns, the news magazine The Economist calls it India's equivalent of the midterms. Regional elections in several states, including Uttar Pradesh, have now begun. It's a 5-week process. Uttar Pradesh population 204 million. It's a high-stakes vote for a prime minister grappling with high inflation, trying to rebound from his climb down on an unpopular farm reform. The ruling Hindu nationalists going all in on identity politics in the run-up to this vote. The arrest of journalists in Kashmir, the backing of a hijab ban in schools in the southern state of Karnataka, and Uttar Pradesh's incumbent far-right chief minister Yogi Adityanath campaigning on the building of Hindu temples on the site where the Ayodhya Mosque once stood.
I have allotted money for the improvement of 700 holy Hindu temples and sites. The money that was previously spent by the opposition on Muslim burial grounds, that money is now being used for holy Hindu sites.
Lila Jacinto, is this a new level?
For India, yeah, it's a new low level. Yogi Adityanath, who's the Hindu monk, comes chief minister, is standing up for election. He ran, his explicit statement is it is the 80% versus the 20%. And that basically runs down the religious, the demographic divide, 80% Hindus against 20% Muslims. So right there and there, you see the BJP strategy of unifying Hindus, which is a very disparate group, but using these religious symbols, which you heard Yogi Adityanath talk about, these classic dog whistles.
Was that even a dog whistle? That was a scream.
Yes. And what is at stake here, frankly, is Yogi Adityanath in the past 5 years that he has been in power. He has changed the rules of the game to such an extent where he makes ordinances and he passes them into legislation using the state as a blunt instrument to legislate things that are, in other words, hate crimes, extrajudicial killings. And this is just the run-up for what Modi is going to face in the election in 2024. So, the test that we're facing in this state is extraordinary because they have completely changed the rules of the game and the abnormal has now become normal. And as you said, we are talking about, more than 200 million Muslims. This is
citizens there.
Yes, Indian Muslims, 4 times
I'm sorry. For me, the 200 million was the population of Uttar Pradesh.
Of Uttar Pradesh, yes. But if you're taking 20% of a billion, right? So we're talking about a lot of Muslim. India is the second most populous Muslim country after Indonesia.
But it's a minority. If we look at the vote total, this is over the past years. We see on the graph the BJP continues to gain ground, and other parties, including ones that support other minorities like the Dalits, they've lost traction. Why?
Because the BJP has a very efficient idea. Their strategy is fantastic. They absolutely do not talk about inflation. They do not talk about economic growth. They don't talk about the disastrous way they handle the pandemic. It is absolutely all about emotion. and religion. And what has happened in this election is the two other opposition parties, which are caste parties, OBCs, sort of other caste parties, the Samajwadi Party and the Bahujan Samaj Party. They, in the last election, they formed a coalition, but in this election, they did not manage to do it. So, we don't know at what margins Yogi Adityanath will win, but the polls are showing that he's very likely to win. And if he doesn't do well in Uttar Pradesh, Narendra Modi's strategy is so soundproof, because if he doesn't win big in Uttar Pradesh, it will be Yogi Adityanath's fault. It won't even affect Narendra Modi's popularity.
So you have a message based on emotion, Nico Hines, and a divided opposition. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting that Modi is kind of harnessing this global trend at the moment for nationalism with his Hindu nationalism, but also this kind of really basic political tactic, which has been employed in lots of countries. Obviously, Trump's probably the most obvious example of, the culture wars and blowing up these culture wars, finding differences between populations to try and drive differences and to make yourself seem like you're on the right side of some ridiculous argument that nobody was making until you started blowing it up into a big argument. And of course, while that is damaging in countries like Britain, where we had Brexit and culture war, things are trying to be tagged on to those old Brexit arguments now. And obviously the culture war has been raging in the US for years and years. And it's very poisonous for the politics there. But it's not usually a question of life and death in the US. Whereas in India, when you're applying these culture war strategies to a country where people are actually still fighting and people are dying in the streets in Kashmir and in disputed regions, it's toxic politics mixed with actual life and death, and it's absolutely terrifying.
Borzudar Gai?
Yeah, I mean, it's also just kind of baffling. You have this, great democratic experiment. You have, for decades, healing going on between the country's Muslims and Hindus, and just take that and throw that, flush it down the toilet, and just find that. I just can't even believe it. Even in Turkey is more subtle with the Kurds. Find the country's most volatile, dangerous fault line and just hammer away at it. And I mean, one day it will explode, and that is going to be a tragedy and a disaster for India.
And with this hijab ban in the South, there's been clashes at schools. Now, it's not officially coming from the state, but schools are now allowed to ban the Muslim headscarf.
Yes, I mean, this is a state that is run by the BJP. Of course, you can see this. And, the targeting of vulnerable women, veiled women trying to go to school, denying them the right to a basic education. But, what comes out of this is really very sad, because you can literally see the India that I grew up in is dead. But what you actually see is that you are driving communities to embrace their community. So in order to feel secure, Muslim women have to embrace their communities, and within these communities, they need to have discussions of the patriarchy, of the ulama. But you cannot possibly have these discussions within the community when they are threatened in such a way. So the BJP strategy just drives minorities to embrace these community leaders, and it serves nobody.
It serves nobody. And Yogi Adityanath, some say, he's the next Prime Minister of India.
Well, that is an extremely chilling proposition. He, his speech is so incendiary. So he was the sort of the bad cop to Narendra Modi's good cop, which makes you see how low the standard is. But if he is a likely candidate for a future prime minister, you can just kiss goodbye to a democracy, a post-colonial democracy that was pretty much a sort of role model for post-colonial countries. That will just die.
It's the Beijing Winter Olympics taking place, second weekend. We've been talking a lot about politics and sports, but forget the Winter Games for a moment. Over in Nico Hines' Great Britain this week, it was all about Kurt Zuma's cat. the brother of the French international defender, filming the West Ham player using his pet as a soccer ball. He's since been stripped of his cat, his sponsorship deal with Adidas, and his popularity. There was copious booing every time Zuma touched the ball during the London side's 1-0 win over Watford Tuesday evening.
I'm a big animal lover, and I think it's something which will have affected a lot of people, so I'm really disappointed with it. But as I said before, my job tonight was to try and win for West Ham and put the best team out I could to give me that chance.
Nico Hines, how much of a talking point is Kurt Zuma's cat?
It's absolutely huge. I think one of the main reasons it's blown up so big and so prominent in the debate is because it's a classic example of someone doing a crime, videoing it, and then putting it on social media, and then being surprised when they get themselves in all sorts of trouble. You couldn't watch the video of the cat being drop kicked. I think it was almost a rugby kick, really, rather than a football manoeuvre. You couldn't watch that and not be shocked and appalled. And so every single person, and Britain is famously, and it really is true, obsessed with its pets and its caring for its animals. And there's all sorts of ridiculous statistics, like people give, I can't remember how, but 10 times more money to charities for animals than they do for saving humans. We're kind of obsessed in this country. So this has really hit a sore point for the nation. And Kurt Zuma achieved almost the impossible in that game this week, and both sets of fans were booing him at the same time. So you don't normally get that from West Ham. They would normally stick up for their own no matter what. So that's how serious this is.
Yeah, saving animals first. Let me ask you this, Nick Spicer, because Adidas dropping its sponsorship deal with Zuma, and some have been pointing out Adidas, which has factories in China and is silent about events taking place there. Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm going to put my cards on the table. Full disclosure, I have 2 cats, and that's shocking. And I'm not sure that people actually care that much about Adidas. I mean, I can't speak for everybody on planet Earth, but that it's really the destiny of this one football player that we're talking about. And I'm not sure people are going to say, oh, he kicked a cat, and let's think about what Adidas is doing. Sure, if the point is Adidas is hypocritical and they don't have ethics in everything they do, I take that point. But I think there's just no rewinding those pictures. And I share Nico's thoughts that you just don't video. If there's video cameras everywhere, just stop doing this kind of thing.
So I mean, and I don't understand what you mean. Because Uyghurs are being oppressed, you can kick a cat.
No,
what?
I understand what they're saying. In a sense, if there was a video of a Uyghur being treated really horribly by a football player, I'm sure they would drop him as well. It's just the video and it reminds me of that German movie based on the book where Hitler rises up from the dead and he becomes this big popular social media figure, and then video emerges of him kicking a dog, and then his stock collapses, and no one likes Hitler anymore. But look, I think this case, these are like these athletes are these multi-millionaires, these spoiled, pampered dudes with like questionable values, and we turn them into heroes. And
agree,
it's a big mistake, because these guys are oftentimes they were privileged and pampered and adored since they were in before even middle school. They go through their upper education and teen years as these stars. They become they think they can get away with anything, and it's a mistake to make people like that heroes.
Nico Hines, can he overcome this one or make fans forget?
I don't think fans will forget. This is one of those things that will always be. He will always be the cat-kicking footballer. But I think it's not going to drum him out of the game. He'll still be there. People will be coming up with ever more inventive chants to take the mickey out of him. But I'm sure that once he's sucked up his endorsement losses, and I think West Ham fined him £250,000, which is pretty painful, but he gets paid way too much money, so I think he'll be all right.
£125,000 a week is his salary.
Right. Well, so 2 weeks' salary he got docked. All right. Well, after doing the math, we'll leave it there, unfortunately. I want to thank you, Borzo Daragahi, Lila Jacinto, Nico Hines in London, Nick Spicer in Berlin. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.